Gernot Wagner is a climate economist at Columbia Business School. His research, writing, and teaching focuses on climate risks and climate policy. Gernot writes a monthly column for Project Syndicate and has written 4 books including Geoengineering, The Gamble, and Climate Shock. Before joining Columbia and serving as faculty director of the Climate Knowledge Initiative, Gernot taught at NYU and Harvard. In this conversation, I kept coming back to this hope that climate action could be, in some ways, uncomplicated. If the primary goal is to stop greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible in order to deal with this as a genuine emergency, it should be simple. But within the existing system of global capitalism that we have, though, how is that going to happen? Can it happen? I've been trying to think about this by having conversations with people like Gernot, people like Kyla Tienhaara, Seth Klein, Mark Paul, and others, to just sort of attempt to get to the bottom of it. It's tough, but in these interviews, which I'll release in the coming weeks, I've been helped by their writing. We're at a point where, according to economists like Robert Pollin, at least 1 to 2% of global GDP will need to be spent pretty much immediately on investments in renewable infrastructure to radically reduce emissions. Global GDP is about $80 trillion. How does that amount of globally coordinated investment happen under capitalism? It's a huge shift in the nature of the whole economy. One of the reasons I wanted to return to Wagner's writing is that I've been helped a lot by his explanation of the social cost of carbon, and especially the way that he writes about considerations of equity and justice in determining the social cost of carbon. It radically increases the calculation of damages that are created by emitting greenhouse gases, but what that means, in fact, is that if we factor in issues of equity, the number skyrockets, validating any and all investments in climate mitigation and adaptation. The question for me is, how could that sort of information become more central to decision-making and policy-making? We definitely get into the weeds here. I'm still processing the discussion we have about green growth versus the Green New Deal versus degrowth. I still can't say where I land on the question of whether decarbonization needs to happen in a textbook degrowth way. It's hard to balance expediency and strategy here, and yet increasingly the debate about economic transformation to fight climate change hinges on our receptivity to growth or degrowth. What I like is that there is room here for the debate. We need to rapidly phase out fossil fuels, that much is certain. In fact, we need to fully ban fossil fuels. How that decision gets made and what form action takes, at what speed and with what consequences, is still an open question. So, I wish that we could just sort of talk about anything other than the climate emergency. But it's ongoing, it's escalating, it's accelerating. And yet, we're at a moment where just this week, the first ever African Climate Summit concluded. We're coming up on the 28th COP, but this is the first African Climate Summit. And the sort of culmination of it was the signing of the Nairobi Declaration. And I thought we could kind of start on this recent piece of news, which we could see as maybe a watershed moment, hopefully. The Nairobi Declaration calls for a global carbon price on fossil fuel trade, shipping, and aviation, among other things. Like they demand in the declaration a huge increase in renewable energy capacity throughout Africa. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, but I guess, I'm sort of checking in about the struggle over carbon pricing, because it's something that Seth Klein has written has sort of come to dominate the discussion about how to shift our carbon intensive way of life away from what is so obviously disastrous, the course that we're on. This has been a horrifying summer, and it's clear that we're at a point where decarbonizing has to happen right now. In fact, long before now. because you've written about how pricing pollution, putting a high enough price on carbon can be an answer to the crisis, what I'm wondering basically is, you know, are you concerned at all about this kind of push for a carbon tax? Do you think it's adequate?
It is, or it would be. Is this going to mean that we will have a global uniform carbon tax with sort of the perfect, no, of course not, right? Um, is it good that there's an understanding that, yes, that would be the right move in the right direction? Of course, sure. But frankly, I think the exciting bit right about now is precisely that there is this global clean energy race, and it is a race among nations, um, in the right direction. Are we winning this climate fight as we speak? No, we are not. Are there lots of things happening that are pointing in the right direction? Yes, absolutely. And the exciting bit, I guess, is that it goes well beyond this, what I would call a bit of a naive call for, the carbon tax that will finally solve this problem once and for all. It won't.
Mm-hmm.
Or for that matter, the sort of perfect policy that will, do it all. It exists in theory, sure. Will we get it? Well, no, right? We haven't in decades.
Yeah, I think this is something that I kind of got out of reading Holly Jean Buck's book, Ending Fossil Fuels, but also Ministry for the
Hmm.
Future, Kim Stanley Robinson's kind of sprawling climate fiction opus.
Yes.
The idea that there are, first of all, just sort of cognitive errors that human beings make in looking for the single unitary, like base cause. And I think
Yep.
like bring that into conversation with like Buck's book. She talks about how something like fossil fuel subsidies, for example, are seen as low hanging fruit to some extent. Like you just remove fossil fuel subsidies, but doing that has particular like knock on effects in the economy that might sort of hamstring climate action in certain ways. It's just like you start pulling at this very densely knotted problem, and it doesn't easily unravel. And so, like I think what the last time we spoke, the thing that you sort of pointed to and really emphasized in our conversation, when talking about shifting away from like fossil fuel dependency, is the sort of baseline problem of changing social norms.
Hmm.
Like that's not one single problem, right? It's like many problems sort of interwoven. And it does feel like if we're just focusing on pricing carbon, we're avoiding like discussions about social norms. We're avoiding discussions about like regulation too. And I wanted to ask you about your kind of evolving thinking around regulation. It feels like regulating both production and consumption of fossil fuels is something that is difficult. And you point out that like nobody has yet done it, right? There could be targeted bans, but it's just not happened yet.
Well, actually, okay. So let's start with bans of fossil fuel, right?
Hmm.
So turns out that was the very first time we ever tried to do anything about the burning of fossil fuels was in fact a ban. And this is way back when, and no, it wasn't for climate reasons.
Hmm.
But in 1306 England, I hope I'm getting the date right now. It's King Edward the First, right? Like 14th century stuff.
Wow. Yeah.
We had a ban on the burning of sea coal. Penalty for repeat offenders, death. Now, okay, not done for climate reasons, right? It was done because the air in central London and Nottingham and so all was, filthy. And I think the
Hmm.
Queen mom or the King's mom had asthma or suffered from some kind of debilitating illness. And the son, the king, banned the burning of sea coal. By the way, that ban did not last long. His brother, I believe, got rid of it again. It turns out, right, the sort of energy is just too valuable, and people burned it anyways, right? And you can't execute everyone, so it turns out that that ban disappeared.
Wow.
Now that said, okay, fast forward to today. England, Great Britain has two coal plants still in existence, and none of them, as far as I know, today are running, right? So like we went from a ban through, one industrial revolution later and like a million people or so, 5% of the workforce working in the coal sector, to basically fewer than 2,000 people working in the British coal sector, and no operating coal plant. Now, okay, is that a ban? No, it wasn't, right? Like coal was not banned. Coal was not regulated out of existence by basically saying thou shalt not burn any coal. But well, for lots of factors, and Margaret Thatcher trying to crush the coal union was one of the main causes, by the way, of the sort of decline of the last 4 decades or so of the British coal sector. So it wasn't all done for climate reasons. So for the most part, actually, it wasn't. But effectively, we have, well, regulated coal out of existence in the all-encompassing sense of the term. And of course, some of this is, gas has become so cheap as the alternative to coal, as the fossil alternative to coal. And no, that's not all good news. Methane leakage is a big problem, and so on and so forth. But yeah, CO2 emissions are down as a result. Was that one, right, benevolent social planner calling for the end of coal as we know it? No, it was lots of contributing factors. But yeah, effectively, the burning of coal might as well be banned in Great Britain right about now, in the UK right about now, because it is. Nobody wants to do it anymore. Right? Like
Right.
it's gone.
It's been phased out, but like sort of for almost social and economic reasons. Certainly
Exactly.
still a problem globally, right?
Of course, of
But
course.
is it where the social license around coal has disappeared to some extent in the UK?
Yes, right. Okay, and now, okay, so now the big question is, okay, so how do you do this more widely? Well, okay, let's go to the US. Last count, I think is 210 operating coal plants in the US. Right,
Hmm.
that's 210 more than there should be.
Hmm.
Um, and by the way, there's this amazing RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute study of those coal plants, the coal transition, where basically I think it's for 209 out of those 210, almost all of them, it would pay to shut down the currently operating coal plant and replace it with quote unquote local renewables, right? So I mean that's sort of the key bit, right? It's not as
Hmm.
easy as saying, oh, it will be cheaper to produce solar power down in Arizona, so let's shut down the coal plant in Maine, right? Like that's not how that works. It's about local replacement of that source of electricity. And yes, it's literally there's one coal plant in Wyoming where that's not the case, apparently, according to this study. But for the other 209 out of 210, yeah, you could shut down the coal plant, replace it with locally produced solar electricity plus 4 hours of storage built in already, or wind, again, local wind sources,
Hmm.
and it would pay economically right now, as in the operating expenses of the coal plant, not
Hmm.
counting the climate pollution, just the operating expenses of the coal plant are higher than it would be to replace, like to build the solar PV facility or the wind farm and so on, and produce the same kind of electricity,
Right.
right?
There's a business case for it.
There is a narrow business case for doing so. Now, okay, why isn't it already happening? Well, because
Mm-hmm.
of vested interests, because of the coal plant has the right to put the electricity on the grid, and the solar farm next door doesn't. And right, there's lots and lots of questions. There is
Hmm.
power purchasing agreements that lock in coal power for 20 years and so on and so forth, and basically highly subsidize the production of that coal uh,
Right.
power electricity. And, all of that, these are complex issues, right? None of this is easy to say, oh, by the way, a price on CO2 would solve it. Well, actually, as this example shows, it would help, of course, but no, it actually wouldn't, right? Because
Mm.
the power purchasing agreement, well, with or without carbon tax, is still going to stand in the way of replacing that coal plant immediately, even if it is even more uneconomic to run with
Mm.
the carbon tax than without the carbon tax. So, Yeah, complex problem, complex solutions. Now, would this price on CO2 help in theory, and does it do so in practice? Of course it does, but
Mhm.
no, it's not the one size fits all solution.
And what about pairing it? Because, like in Nova Scotia, we're seeing the introduction of not just carbon pricing, but also clean fuel regulations. Like that's a separate but related thing. And you've spoken about how clean energy standards are going to need to be put in place to make renewable energy mandatory. With the ultimate vision of a world where there's no demand for carbon and no suppliers of it. Could you kind of expand on like that vision and the place of
Sure. I
clean
mean,
energy
well,
policy?
this is sort of okay, and frankly, this is the big question of actually what counts as a price per ton of CO2. So,
Right.
the US does not have a federal price like that, sure. Well, we do have renewable portfolio standards at the state level. Over half of US states have those RPSs, which basically, up to a point, mandate renewables to be entering the system, the grid.
Hmm.
And well, if you calculate the implicit price of some of these standards, they actually are to the tune of a couple $100 per ton of CO2. So, implicitly, yeah, there is a price on CO2, a pretty high one, or, high enough to sort of be in the order of magnitude of what it should be. And that's all good news. And yes, right, so Nova Scotia or elsewhere, where you basically have the sort of incentives that point in the right direction.
Hmm.
Um, well, would you count them as a price on CO2 directly?
Hmm.
Maybe not directly, indirectly, certainly.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that. I'm really interested in this, and it kind of gives us an opportunity to move into. I feel like we're kind of, I want to move into basically like theories of economics, like the structural view, because there is this concern that we hear really from like most sides of the political spectrum, except for maybe like the what I'll call like radical eco-socialists, which are not to disparage them. Like I think that uncompromising position is a legitimate one, but there are concerns that slapping taxes on energy is going to destabilize whole economies. How do we price, as it were, or regulate fossil fuels out of the market, which we're agreeing is a necessity, without like blowing up the whole model? Like, is it necessary to kind of scrap it, as it were, in order to,
Well, okay,
and rewrite
so
it?
okay, loaded question.
Sure.
No
Yeah.
simple answer. I mean, frankly, what has happened, and maybe this is in some sense the biggest shift as of late. This is the International Energy Agency, right? No sort of activist organization,
Hmm.
saying in I think 2020, 2019, that solar PV is now the cheapest form of electricity in history. It's the cheapest source of electricity in
Hmm.
history. It's under certain conditions, right? You've got to put the solar panel on the south side of the roof if you're in the northern hemisphere, not the north side, and so on, right? And you need cheap
Hmm.
financing and so on and so forth, of course. But yeah, there's no turning back either, right? Like if solar PV is the cheapest way to produce electricity, the technology is only going to get better, right? We're
Hmm.
not going to get worse at producing solar PV panels. We're going to get better. It'll be even cheaper. And in some amazing sense, right? Sort of the immediate rejoinder might be of someone in like 2022 to say, oh, wait, didn't solar PV just increase in price relative to 2021? Yeah, it did. But fossil fuels increased by even more, right? So this is sort of at the height of the fossil inflation
Hmm.
crisis after after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and so on, whereas fossil prices were increasing by like 200% or so, right, over a few
Yeah.
months. Solar PV increased by like 20%. Okay, fine, right? Solar PV prices did go up in an absolute sense, but the
Mm.
relative price that matters compared to fossils, solar PV was even cheaper
Right.
at the height of that fossil inflation period than compared to anything else.
Mhm.
And yeah, maybe, or I would say not just maybe, but definitely, that is the biggest change we have seen of late. Is precisely these massive declines in the price of solar power compared to basically anything else, right? I mean, wind has gone down too, and it was sort of cheaper for longer, it had been cheaper for longer, but there's just no comparison even between wind and the rapid price decline of solar PV.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that's just right. That's a completely different world. This is
Yeah.
literally right, and this is now
Yeah.
these sort of socio-economic tipping points, these positive tipping points, where it used to be there were massive subsidies for solar in Germany, so there were a bunch of Bavarian villages where basically you couldn't see a single home without solar panels on the roof, right? And all of that is good, sure, but it was it was small scale, if you will. It's
Hmm.
certainly not small scale today, right?
Yeah, and like we should definitely talk about scale in detail, I think, right? I watched Oliver Stone's new Nuclear Now documentary, and he kind of writes off renewables as not really being able to provide the level of meet electricity demand globally that we're going to see. And, we need to be thinking about trying to, I think, scale down electricity usage. It's, insane the amount of energy that, is demanded in the market. But a lot of the debate in terms of scale about sort of economic transformation to fight climate change has really kind of hinged on the whole green growth or Green New Deal argument versus the degrowth or scaling down argument. And like Robert Pollin writes really clearly about this. He says, the degrowthers, from his perspective, never really engage with the question of like building infrastructure or what he
Yeah.
calls like the climate stabilization project that's going to, save us effectively. They're not necessarily looking at the numbers, he says, in terms of immediate economic impacts. Under the Clean Energy Investment Project, average incomes would roughly double, while under degrowth, average incomes would experience a historically unprecedented collapse. This is his economic projection. Do you think decarbonization can be done in a pro-growth way? Is growth at all a problem?
Okay, so I think that's, I mean, it's, in many ways, that's exactly the question that degrowthers are asking,
Right.
right? Or that's in some sense where degrowth got its start, if you will. Okay, so let me put it this way.
Mm-hmm.
We've had these philosophical discussions long before climate became the defining issue.
That's
Um,
true.
and frankly, I mean, this is going back way back when, right? Like, Karl Marx, right? Writing critiques, potent critiques, and so on, of, the prevailing capitalist system and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And these debates have been happening forever, right? Degrowth is not new at all. Um, Degrowth itself has undergone this amazing transformation, if you will, over just the last decade, in the sense that, right, that like the first sort of, the first popular book written on the topic was basically about, oh, growth is the problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? Economic growth is the problem. Well, fast forward to today, and the argument is much more nuanced in the sense of, oh, growth of certain sectors is the problem, right? Big cars are bad, and they are, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so, that sector ought to shrink. And, we can all look at that and say, yeah, we agree. Like, sure, fine, right? Big cars kill more pedestrians than anything, and so on and so forth. And we've
Mm-hmm.
undone the benefits of safer travel over 3 or 4 decades, basically within the last decade of SUVs and cell phones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Distracted drivers and massive cars, and yeah, that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
But what tells us that it's bad is not some sort of philosophical macro degrowth argument. What tells us that it's bad is the very detailed microeconomic, if you will, study of figuring out how many more people die with every additional kilogram or pound of weight of one of these vehicles,
Sure.
right?
And they're
Um,
also belching more greenhouse gas emissions, all that.
and there's more CO2 and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So basically, the real argument is, yeah, there are technologies, there are products, there are entire economic sectors where there is more damage being caused by that one product, let's say, then it adds value to the economy on the one hand, and in a broader sense to society more broadly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to be clear, you're speaking with someone who has never had a driver's license, has never driven in his life, right? So yeah, cars suck, right? They kill everything, right? Whatever the
Mm-hmm.
the, the
Mm-hmm.
hashtags are on no longer Twitter, Mastodon, and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree, of course.
Yeah.
But to arrive at that argument, right, that's not degrowth. That's not some philosophical, oh, there must be
Mm-hmm.
a better world. Couldn't we all live happily ever after? I mean, yes, I'd like to think that there is a better world out there, of course. And I hope most of us, all of us do, right? Like basically, all you need to do is look out the window and realize that not everything is running swimmingly all the time. There are
For
some
sure.
problems that deserve fixing, of course. But again, this is not some sort of philosophical growth versus degrowth. It's basically trying to say, in a much more nuance, here is stuff that causes massive externalities. So let's, shrink that particular sector. Let's get rid of
Right.
it. Let's
Yeah.
transform it fundamentally. And then there's other things. And, you mentioned Inflation Reduction Act, Green New Deal, and so on, where
Mm-hmm.
cutting emissions means massive investments in the right kind of low carbon, high efficiency technologies. And when I say low carbon, high efficiency, right, it means both. It means produce more clean electricity on the one hand. And yes, of course, use less where
Mm-hmm.
that is appropriate on the other. Of course, that's part of the solution, right? Let's not, just because you have unlimited carbon free electricity does not mean that you shouldn't be insulating your windows better and decrease electricity demand in the first place. Better insulation, energy efficiency, um, living more densely in urban environments and
Mm-hmm.
walkable urbanism and so on and so forth, right, is a good idea regardless. Doesn't matter whether there is limitless carbon free electricity to go around. There are, better ways to organize ourselves as society, and we should aim for that. And again, we should do that because we figured out that there are problems associated with the way we organize society right now and the way, ever larger single family homes ever further out and so on and so forth. Um, that's not a degrowth argument, right? That's basically saying we are internalizing externalities, both the negative ones and the positive ones.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting to kind of like see somebody like Pollan sort of reducing it to a division between these two camps, even if that it's accurate. It sort of speaks to how so much hinges really on communication and trying to shift these social norms. Like you do need to try to broadcast the benefits
Mm-hmm.
to like regular folks in order to make clear what the value is of this shift for them, for their lives, I think.
Right? Like you figured out a better way to organize yourself as a society,
Yeah.
as a small group of like fantastic. You want to call that degrowth? Go ahead. Fantastic. Um, but like you said, right, it's sort of picking people up where they are. And yes, green growth, if you will, right? Growing the right kind of sector, this green growth mindset, if you will. There's a lot to that, right? There's a
Mhm.
lot to basically saying, wait, this is an opportunity. There are more jobs here in the green sector than the dirty one, and that's a good thing. So
Mhm.
let's invest in this technology. And by the way, that too is a good thing.
Yeah, the tricky part is like we don't necessarily. I think it's potentially polarizing to make it about schools of thought, make it about different philosophies, make it about your political stripes. Like we have learned that that is the case, but like the unfortunate thing in some ways is that we do respond to symbols, that there is like totemic power to the logic of fossil fueled freedoms, that people are attached to those things. There is similarly a kind of totemic power to living in better relationship to nature. It's just like working within those symbolic economies while also making the case that, this is a more sensible way to live, a more sustainable, let's say, way to live, is a really difficult communicational challenge.
So in a like sort of discussions like this, I always like to sort of point out the American Enterprise Institute Walkable Neighborhoods program. I believe that's what it's called. Sorry, Walkable Oriented Development.
Right.
Is like a conservative think tank has a research program, a policy program about how walkability is going to create better neighborhoods, a better society.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I can tell you that program has been around for a while, and it's sort of like I would like to think it's kind of like like an obvious thing to look at if you care about pro family, pro neighborhood, and so on policies. Let's figure out whether in some sense, yeah, there is a better way to organize ourselves as a society than the predominant ever larger single family homes ever further out, bigger cars, and so on and so forth, right?
Sure,
Okay,
yeah.
this is a conservative think tank in DC that has a serious research program and this policy program around this question. Most conversations around urbanism, walkability, usually fall squarely along the political spectrum, right? It's the conservative side who basically says, no, this is, 15-minute city is some liberal conspiracy theory type thing, right? And the liberals who then, dig themselves in and say, oh, you conservative urbanites, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is the socialism demands that we live closer together in smaller units and walk everywhere and so on and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then there is AEI, American Enterprise Institute, with a research policy program, basically cutting across the aisle, if you will. Now, okay,
Mm-hmm.
not to present AEI now here as gods, but
But it's
yeah,
an interesting,
they're onto
exception to the
something.
rule, right?
Of
Like that,
course, right?
yeah.
And by the way, okay, is that degrowth?
Mm.
Well, it means, smaller apartments, less physical space taken up by individual homes, fewer cars. And by the way, cars, right, cost quite a bit of money and add quite a bit of, money to GDP and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So, is that yeah, in a sense, you could call it that if packaging it as that, gets you somewhere. Now, of course, AEI would never call it degrowth, but actually, that's the point, right? This is well beyond this broad philosophical discussion of, is growth good? Yes, no. And is much, much closer to the conversation of, wait, what are the sort of levers to look at? What are the sort of ways to, frankly, improve the way we organize ourselves, to go back to that phrase?
Mm-hmm.
And, well, AEI, much like the lefty urban YIMBY, have apparently come up with very similar solutions, which, by the way, yes, will also cut CO2 emissions
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
as a
it's weird.
result.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the kind of it's emphasizing, you could say, health over wealth, right? Like and health it feels like health rarely gets brought into the conversation around around climate breakdown, which I find so strange. When I teach health communication, I do refer to the climate crisis as also a health crisis, and people bristle because they see it more as a line with like crisis communication than health communication. But it's the case that an enormous number of people, millions, die every year from air pollution, according to The Economist. And yeah, like that information doesn't necessarily get brought into the sort of purview of health communication for whatever reason. Perhaps because it would just short circuit established ways of thinking about health, which are pretty individualistic, I think. But anyway, like, to kind of shift gears to some extent, I wanted to talk about sort of the industry to some extent, and technology, and the sort of, continued denialism that exists, or at least deflection that exists, where you have the industry really banking on the emergence of these technologies like carbon capture and storage, or like the industry presenting itself as an ally in climate action, as though the companies that like created the crisis are going to voluntarily take a role in addressing it. You even have, you mentioned natural gas or fossil gas. Like, you have states talking about how they're going to exploit these huge reserves of fracked gas because it's seen as like a bridge fuel. It's better than coal. I guess the question I want to ask is, like, how do we deal with the fact that there are still companies like BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Saudi Aramco that like will look at the truth of climate breakdown, and just invest in massive numbers of new fossil fuel projects? Like, it's not denialism, it's not deceit, it's something way more brazen than that. Is that a thing that we can just like understand in purely economic terms? How do you I don't know. How do you think about that as a climate economist?
Well, okay, so the purely economic analysis is, look, the incentives are pointing in the wrong direction, right?
Sure.
It's profitable to frack. It's profitable to do the sort of things that you and I might look at and say, yeah, we shouldn't be doing this anymore, right? We know
Mm-hmm.
enough to know. Well, we know enough to know as a society, and at the same time, yeah, we still subsidize fossil fuels, billions
Mm-hmm.
of dollars a year globally. Um, and, we don't force those companies to internalize the negative externality generated by those activities. They're massive externalities. And of
Right.
course, that's the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, you can talk a big game about doing good, and you can write your ESG reports and sustainability reports and so on. But if it's still profitable to do the nasty, dirty stuff, the polluting, then somebody somewhere is going to do it. And those massive companies that have made quite a bit of money um, digging up CO2 and digging up fossil fuels and burning them, yeah, they will continue to do so as long as it's profitable to do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So of course the task is, and now we are back to where we started, right? Pricing
Mm-hmm.
carbon writ large, right? Of course the task is to move away from the high carbon, low efficiency world to a low carbon, high efficiency world. And to do that with a combination of policy on the one hand, yes, of course, and to basically figure out the low carbon, high efficiency business models that are in fact profitable. And they exist, they very much do, right?
Right.
Um, and move in that direction, right? I mean, this is sort of okay, like, not to bring it back to the walkable neighborhoods bit again, right? But
Mm-hmm.
well, like, those sorts of more desirable places to live, well, on a per square foot, per square meter basis, command quite a bit of money, much more money than the sprawling urbanite single family home. Of course, right? In some sense, that's part of the problem, right? It's so
Mm-hmm.
it's so expensive to quote unquote do the right thing, right? Live in the walkable neighborhood, that lots of families choose otherwise. Okay, that's a market signal, that's a price signal pointing in many ways in precisely the wrong direction. Now,
Mm-hmm.
what do you do? How do you do this? Yeah, of course, right? Changing norms, shifting norms, and so on, certainly
Mm-hmm.
part of the solution, which is
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
basically say, like, yes, right? Like, we need to get away from this mindset that, you can only live properly as a young family with a couple young kids if you live in the sprawling urban mansion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the good life, so sort of. Of course, right? So norms play a big role, right? Of course they do. And this is where the American Enterprise Institute's Walkability program comes in, and so on and so forth, right? There's a bit of that. On the other hand, economics, of course, plays a huge role.
The two things have to be seen as connected, right?
Of course, and they are, right? So we don't build enough of the sort of homes that would allow more families to live in walkable neighborhoods close, in the urban core, right? And, we don't. We just don't, right? That's why, in many ways, the price signals go in that direction of per square foot, per square meter prices are so high. Okay, back to
Mm-hmm.
your question around, fossil fuel interests and so on.
Yeah.
Well, different example, but exactly the same thing, right? Like, do norms and so on play a big role? Of course they do, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you basically live in a decarbonized home and well insulated home and so on, and you've cut your electricity, or you cut the gas line, right? Let's start with that, right? Like, you stop burning fossil fuels in your home because it turns out that the induction stove and the heat pump are just fundamentally better technologies than what has come before,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they are. And by the way, there is an induction plate available at IKEA for $50 or $60 or so, right? Like, basically, this is not, oh, yes, this is like for the rich and so on. No, it's not. It really isn't. It's a
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally better technology that allows you to stop burning fossil fuels in your home, stop poisoning your kids while you're at it and giving them asthma and so on. And of course, cutting CO2 emissions too. But then it also comes down to the raw economics and setting the
Right.
economic incentives in the right direction.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely part of this shift, this what I
Mm-hmm.
would call, again, positive tipping point, where we do see massive changes in the right directions, rapid changes in the right direction, and no
Mm-hmm.
turning back, right? Like, this is what is asked before about bans and the role of these sorts of regulations. Like, yeah, it is absolutely appropriate for neighborhoods, for entire cities, right? New York City, New York State, one of them, to basically ban gas connections to new homes by
Right.
essentially saying, look, there's a better way to do this. We don't have to lock ourselves in decades more of burning fossil fuels in your own home if there
Mm-hmm.
is a better alternative available, and it's better for you, it is cheaper, it's better for the planet, and so on and so forth. Right? This is like
Yeah.
the George W. Bush light bulb efficiency standard, right? Like, Bush was the one who signed the standard into
Right.
law that
Yeah.
effectively banned incandescent light bulbs, and we
Mm-hmm.
are better off for it.
And like created sort of a domino effect globally, where for the most part that's the standard everywhere. Um,
Absolutely, yes.
and
I
like
mean, if you're a massive, you're Siemens, right? You're General Electric, right? Like, you're not going to produce one type of bulbs for one jurisdiction and another type of bulb for another. If the better technology, the better LEDs, are better for everybody, right? Better for you as a business model, and
mhm.
yes, again, better for the planet, better for consumers, and so on and
Yeah.
so forth.
And it's funny, like I think, I'm seeing at least in some places, people sort of reject the idea of a completely clean transition to renewables in the sense of like where the materials come from, right? I know that you've keyed into this debate as well, but the idea that electrifying transportation, for example, is going to it's going to cause this massive increase in the extraction of certain minerals, and that there are going to be whole countries, communities that are going to be, if that doesn't happen ethically, devastated in the same way that fossil fuel extraction has devastated particular places. The so-called resource curse is not unique to fossil fuel extraction. And I kind of wanted to get, maybe to, return to the question of Africa, a continent that is disproportionately not responsible for the climate crisis, and yet it might, it almost certainly will suffer the worst impacts. For that shift to happen ethically, we can't discount the kind of larger global frame, and considering the question of social justice globally, as somehow like unrealistic. I think like that's where my head's at, right? And I wondered, because you've written a lot about equity in terms of like the social cost of carbon. How do we consider that and not see that as just like an afterthought?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here.
Mm-hmm.
I guess let me start with this, right? So, tackling CO2 emissions is a good thing. Let's start with that. But no, tackling CO2 emissions is not going to solve every social problem out there, right? So this is not, oh, wow, we finally found the problem that if that problem, right, if we fix that one, we will fix everything else at once,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Absolutely not. And by the way, yes, of course, there are some trade-offs. There always are, right? This is, ever since philosopher Mick Jagger, right? You can't always get what you want, right? So yeah, there are trade-offs, well known. And um, yes, by shifting rapidly, um, appropriately so, I would say, because of the climate problem, but by shifting rapidly toward low carbon technologies, we are in fact opening up some other problems. Of course, we are. We need to set the right labor standards globally, and name and shame the companies that skirt them abroad while talking a big game at home in the Western democracy and so on and so forth. Of course, we are opening up some of these problems. Right? This is the famous cover of the Economist, from petrostate to electrostate, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like moving away from petro and toward electro, that's the good part. The fact that that's yet again a state, a country that is not exactly a democracy here, right? The electrostate,
Mm-hmm.
China in this case, and that opens up problems in and of itself. That is a massive problem to consider as we are engaging in this rapid transition. At the same time, um, is the is the negative externality we are fixing, we are solving in this process, is that quote unquote worth it to do? Well, that's where global geopolitics and so on comes in, and where the weighing of these trade-offs is crucial, is
Mm-hmm.
important, and where no, the answer isn't always clear in every one of these instances. But frankly, in general, just sort of looking at the material throughput, if you will, right? Like this is sort of back to a technocratic way of looking at this. The hundreds of billions of tons, whatever your metric is, right? Weight or volume, fossil fuels that are being burned, right? They're being dug up, moved across the globe, and then burned. Um, in no comparison to like orders of magnitude less of the minerals, the precious metals, and so on necessary to produce the solar panels, to produce the wind turbines, to produce the low carbon technologies. So no, we are not solving every problem, and we are opening up some others in the process.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, are there better ways to produce electricity, to generate energy, create the useful form of energy here, than the burning of fossil fuels? Absolutely. And we are, in fact, decreasing overall our environmental footprint as we do so. Orders of magnitude, right? 2 or 3 orders of magnitude less of materials needed to produce the same kind of electricity, energy with solar panels, low carbon technologies compared to fossil fuels.
It's to be continued, right? Like we have by no means, as you just sort of framed it, like solved all these problems. But I like your point that gains are being made, while like that we're trending in the right direction, and like that. I'm certainly not going to ask about the question of whether you have you're optimistic or pessimistic, whether you have hope. I think like it's the job of people who are doing this analysis to try and make hope convincing. Like the onus is on us, in some sense, to talk about how energy systems can be more efficient and less destructive, and how we can like live in more like vibrant societies, basically.
It's the job of the American Enterprise Institute, right? And its walkable oriented development program to figure out how to make walkable urbanism palatable or desirable to, frankly, the usual clientele of the American Enterprise Institute, right? So it's not the job of, the lefty liberal urbanite necessarily, or for the matter, they're not the right messenger to do this. And absolutely, right, it is about, frankly, making the better, more desirable, lower carbon way of organizing ourselves, both using the lower carbon technologies on the one hand, and then figuring out a way to make use of them, to use them to reorganize ourselves as society. To make that the more desirable alternative, right? To make it cheaper on the one hand, and overall more desirable. And it takes all of the above, right? It does take AEI to talk about walkable-oriented development as something desirable, and make it look sexy, make it look like something you want to do, because it's better for your family, because it's better for you and your loved ones. And yes, it takes telling positive stories like that to achieve this transition.
Yeah, it's a great place to kind of land, I think, leaving us to kind of think about the right messenger and that challenge in relationship to the stuff we sort of know, right? Which is that the technology exists. It's, the cheapest source of electricity, but there are these complex barriers that exist, vested interests and so on. So how do you, continue to kind of pull the levers you can pull, all these metaphors, right? Keep momentum, gain traction. This is, it remains the struggle, even in the aftermath of so many climate disasters over the last few months, and unfortunately more to come. Like this is part of the discussion too. It's like there are people for whom this is, these wildfires, for example, have been life-changing and place redefining. But just showing people the charts and the numbers, the lines going off the chart, quite literally, it's just, to me, that is not as impactful as trying to provide sort of a narrative that explains, what is possible, what is sort of discussed as impossible, and the place of you in it, right? Like this idea of just trying to expand the circle beyond this fossilized thinking or this existing fairly exclusionary, let's say eco-socialist thinking, just trying to create a system by which more people can be included in the context of what we might call climate action is part of the challenge for sure.
Exactly, right. A better world is possible, and it's desirable for you, your family, your loved ones, and yes, and and the planet. Yes, of course.
Of course, yeah. Anyway, thanks so much. This has been really, really interesting. Always great talking to you.
Thanks, Scott.